so I drove my car up to Charlie's house, and I knocked on the door, and it was a huge place, and this door came open, you know, and there was a fireplace that was like 10 feet tall and a roaring fire, and he was playing Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, and I said, oh, Charlie, you know, it's really comforting to hear that you're listening to Miles, because to tell you the truth, I don't listen to the Rolling Stones very much. He said, well, that's all right, mate, neither do we.
He's a jazz musician who spent more than his share of time in the rock and roll world as Steve Miller's piano player. Ben Sidran has forged a musical career as a performer, producer, as well as being a professor that can be held up as the template for how not to let the business grind you down. We met up with the man who has played with virtually all of jazz's legends in his hometown of Madison, Wisconsin. Ben, in your autobiography, in your early years, you said that there were two words that jumped off the page for you often. One was Jew and the other one was jazz, but you never saw them on the same page together. What did you mean by that exactly?
Well, literally that. I mean, they would jump off the page. I could open up a book, and if either one of those words was on the page, that's all I would see. It was very strange. And literally, they were never on the same page. You never saw them together.
You felt, I get the impression very distinctly from that book of yours, that you felt not just an outsider, but in a way, you when you were younger, you almost seemed alienated from practically everything around you, including your father.
Yeah, you know, that could be my memory, too. I mean, I wrote that book from the heart. Yeah. I had a heart issue literally before, a year before, and so that book just kind of poured out of me. But I definitely remember being like 5 or 6 and looking out of these same eyes and thinking, I just got to hold on and I'll get out of here. Just another 15, 20 years and I'm out of here. And I had that thought as a little kid, so whatever that means.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell me about your relationship with your father, because it's basically informed the rest of your life. And your father, one of the more poignant things at the very end of your autobiography, when you discover his letters, yeah. And suddenly, long after he's gone, you have a picture of this man that I guess almost ran counter to the image you had of him when you were growing up with him.
Well, my father was one of these spectacular, flashy Jewish Luftmensches, where he was brilliant and good-looking and spoiled by his mother and a ladies' man and loved gambling, loved jazz. I mean, he was an all-around impressive character, and wasn't particularly good with kids, and basically was very tough to get to know. And after the fact, as you say, when I looked back, I realized the person I thought he was wasn't who he was, and that all my problems with him had been my problems, not him. He was just trying to get through it, you know. He had made some wrong choices, like everybody does, and he was just trying to keep his head above water. But as a kid, all I wanted was him to just sort of see that I was there. I thought he was just the greatest guy in the world, and I couldn't get his attention.
Yeah. It's funny because at the beginning of the book, I think you even say that I'm not sure you said you couldn't remember much about him, or you couldn't really describe him that well. But frankly, through the rest of the book, I thought you did a great job of describing him.
Thank you.
He was friends with Saul Bellow.
He was.
Do you remember the line that Bellow told you about your dad after he died?
He said a couple things. He said, never forget your father was a great man. And then he said, and your father essentially kept you at arm's length because he didn't want his problems to be your problems.
I remember you talked about having a lunch with Bellow, having drinks with Bellow when he talked about your dad. I guess when your dad was still alive, but very ill at that point, I believe. How emotional he got about your father.
Yeah, he cried.
That must have been, was that perplexing to you, given what you were thinking about your dad?
Well, you know, at that point, I was in such emotional chaos. You know, I was like 25 years old. It was the anti-war period. We were taking LSD. The Army was trying to draft me. I was at loose ends.
Yeah.
And it was obvious I was going to have to pick up the pieces of my father's life and try to make my mom comfortable and everything. I was really struggling. And so I literally remember being in this restaurant with Sal Bello, and it was pouring rain outside. And so when we were sitting in these leather booths, everything smelled wet, like wet mittens and wet coats. And Bello was crying. It was just this underwater scene.
Yeah, it's astonishing. Yeah. Jazz became your thing very early. That second word, jazz, that jumped off the page.
Yeah, definitely.
Was that I'm trying to remember, but I know you and one of your buddies, you were swiping cars. Mm-hmm. And you got stopped by the cops because you got caught up. I think you were listening to Cannonball Adderley on the radio of the car that you'd stolen and got stopped by the cops.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Tell me that story, because that was pretty funny.
Well, we took cars. That's what we did. You know, it was boring in Racine.
That's what we did.
That is what we did. And back then, we were 13, 14 years old. And they would leave the keys in the cars in used car lots during the day, and then at night they'd take them out. So we just went into the used car lots during the day, took the keys, took it to a key shop, got it copied, and then at night went back and took the car. That's just what we would do. And we'd drive around and we'd bring the car back.
Yeah.
No harm, no foul.
Joyriding.
Joyriding.
Yeah.
So that night, I was driving, and I was not a big kid. I was this big. I mean, I was like driving, and we had the radio on, and this DJ in Chicago named Sid McCoy. We loved Sid McCoy. He had this sign. I say, "Hey, hey, baby, and you too, old bean, welcome. This is something, welcome to the real McCoy." And then he'd play all this great stuff. And he was in love with Nancy Wilson and Cannonball, and oh, man. And even as a 13-year-old kid, I thought, you know, oh, man, when I get out of, this was in Racine, when I get out of Racine and when I get to the city, I was just living it for that day. And so I think I was absorbed by the music and the fact that I was driving this car, and it was at night, and we're driving, and I found out later, I went through some red lights. I wasn't aware of it. But then I saw this flashing red light in my rearview mirror, and I had no idea what it meant. I mean, I'd never seen a flash. I mean, I knew, but I didn't know. And then I got it. So I pulled over. And this cop came over, and he said to me, "Can I see your driver's license?" And I started to laugh, because I was this big, and I was 13 years old. And they took me home.
And he asked your mother where you were, and she says, "You're sleeping out back in the yard in a tent?"
Yeah, I had told her that I was sleeping in the back in a tent with my friend John. And yes, he's out in the back in the tent. And the policeman said, "No, he's right here." And she called upstairs to my father. She said, "Louis, Benny is here, and the police brought him." And my father actually called down and said, "Tell the police they can keep him."
Now, you talk about being, during that period of time, you were searching for something.
Yeah.
And you write about that quite vividly in the book, that you knew that there was something, but you just weren't sure what it was. You end up, and this was amazing to me because I didn't know this about you beforehand, but you ended up getting your doctorate. You are Dr. Ben Sidran.
I'm doctor.
But that too had to do with music. What did you do your thesis on?
Well, let me back up just a little bit. I was at the University of Wisconsin. I was basically an English lit major, but I was hanging out with the history crowd because there was this great radical teacher named Harvey Goldberg, and he taught world revolutions and the French Revolution, and he was an amazing character, and he would hang out at night at the jazz clubs. And of course, I knew him from that. And so when I graduated with an English degree, I thought I'd go to graduate school in English because, as you know, in the United States, if you weren't in graduate school, you were in Vietnam, and so that was how we were all going to stay out. And I wasn't doing very good in graduate school in English. And I was in the student union one day, and I just dropped out of school because I was going to flunk out. And I didn't know what I was going to do, and Harvey Goldberg, this professor, came by and sat down and said, "How you doing?" And I told him the story. I said, "Not very well. I don't know what I'm going to do." And he said two things that were wonderful. He said, "Ben, remember the first thing, the obligation of a revolutionary is to remain free." I love that. That was a nice spin on it for me. And the second thing he said is, you know, there's this university in England, one of these new red brick universities, University of Sussex, and they have an interdisciplinary graduate program. And if you're interested, I'll write a letter for you. And he did. And I wound up going there, and I got there, and what I discovered was being an American was a thing. Because over here, being an American, and that in 25 cents, and you make the phone call. In England, I was in the American Studies program, and I realized that the world was not like us. And I was product of this bizarre culture. And all I knew and all I thought about was jazz. And of course, jazz was black music.
Yeah.
So I started taking seminars in sociology, deviant behavior, all this stuff. And I eventually wrote a dissertation, the PhD dissertation. It was published as a book called Black Talk, How the Music of Black America Created a Radical Alternative to the Values of Western Literary Tradition. And I really got my start from Marshall McLuhan reading.
Yeah, that was amazing to me. And you corresponded with him.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, that was
he
pretty
liked
cool.
it.
Yeah, he did like it.
He did.
That's not bad, I got to say.
That was good. That was good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was good.
So now I'm sure people thinking, listening to you talk about this and doing all of this academic work and living in academia as you were, but you had like this parallel life in another dimension with music. And not just jazz.
No.
Because you were buddies with Steve Miller and Boz Scaggs and these guys, so then you got into that.
They came to England while I was there in graduate school. They came over to make the first record with a very famous producer at the time, a guy named Glyn Johns. He had recorded the Rolling Stones and all these people. And I was in Brighton. They were living in London, and I would just jump on this train. It took an hour at night, and I'd go up there, hang out in the recording studio, and I made the first record, the Steve Miller record. They eventually went back to San Francisco. I was there, and Glyn used to call me up to do recording sessions. So while I was in graduate school and writing the dissertation, the whole thing, I would be going up to London and hanging out with Glyn, and I actually did a session with the Rolling Stones. I did some stuff with Clapton, a band called Spooky Tooth. But honestly, I was not really that interested in rock and roll. As a matter of fact, and this is in the book, of course, this time I did a session with the Rolling Stones, Glyn said to me, look, would you stop and pick Charlie Watts up on the way to London? He lives near you, and he doesn't drive. So I drove my car up to Charlie's house, and I knocked on the door, and it was a huge place, and this door came open, you know, and there was a fireplace that was like 10 feet tall and a roaring fire, and he was playing Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, and I said, oh, Charlie, you know, it's really comforting to hear that you're listening to Miles, because to tell you the truth, I don't listen to the Rolling Stones very much. He said, well, that's all right, mate, neither do we.
Yes, and speaking of the Stones, I know that later on when your son was older and is also a musician, and you got to sit in on a jam session of theirs where it was just them. And,
yeah, it was the Rolling Stones and us in a room. And so they invited, Charlie had talked to my son earlier in the day by coincidence and said, well, come down, we're thing. And so we went down and we sat there. And I kind of knew what to expect, but he was like, oh, we're going to go see the Rolling Stones. And within a half hour, he looked at me and said, let's go. Because without the theater of the audience,
yes,
without the theater of the event,
yeah,
it's just a kind of a sloppy band.
Yeah. What a lesson, though, right?
Yeah.
To see them in that context and realize that it's part of the show. Which brings me to asking you about Steve Miller. You had a long relationship with him. You toured with him. He dropped out of the business,
yes,
then came back to it.
Yes.
And he came back to it at your urging.
Yes.
To do some jazz-oriented things.
Right.
Now, tell me what happened there, because it didn't work out the way either of you thought.
That's exactly right. He had dropped out. His star had risen and risen. He had made a fortune. His last hit was something called Abracadabra. He went on tour, and he didn't do business, really. You know, for whatever reason, the single sold, he wasn't touring. He got frustrated. He walked off the stage. He handed his guitar to his roadie and said, that's it. He bought a big house on a lake in Seattle, got a big boat, named the boat Abracadabra, and just sailed around. So but he owed Capitol Records one more record. He was under contract to them. And he was really, he felt, you know, like Prince had slave written. That's kind of how Steve felt. He felt like he was an indentured servant there. So I was playing in Seattle with my group, and he came down to the club every night, and, you know, he was, gee, this is fun. He brought his guitar, and we were playing. And one night I was at his house, and I played him the material for my new record, and he said, I could do that. That's great. Let's make a record together, and I'll get off at Capitol. And so we ultimately did that. We made this record that was supposed to be my record, but it became his record, so it got him off. And it had these jazz tunes on it, standards, but with kind of like a hip, reharmonized approach. And Steve is a beautiful singer. He sounds a little bit like Chet Baker when he wants, so he represented it well. And he's not a jazz musician, but, you know, the blues works over jazz. And I just said to him, look, play the blues. Don't pay any attention to what we're doing. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. You play the blues, and it'll really work. And so we made the record. The record came out, and Steve said, we're going to do one more tour, and that's it. It's my farewell tour. We're going to go around the country and play jazz. That was it. But when we got out there, he found thousands and thousands of screaming teenagers who had picked up his greatest hits CD while he had been retired. Yeah. And he was back. And
back, and as you say in the book, and this is quite accurate, I think, trapped now in that bubble of just the hits.
Can't get out. Anytime he plays a new song, writes a new song, crowd goes quiet. Yeah. Goes quiet. Plays Jungle Love or one of his hits, crowd goes nuts. Yeah. Plays 3 in a row, crowd is totally stoked. Plays a new tune, crowd goes quiet.
In a few weeks from the date that we are sitting here filming this interview, I'll be going to the International Jazz Festival in my hometown of Ottawa, and he's playing.
Yeah, he's playing Jazz Festival.
And I thought, well, I'm going to watch what you described in that book, because I'm pretty sure he's going to have to do all that stuff.
Of course.
He's caught in that rut.
Well, and he likes the rut. I mean, honestly,
it's a lucrative rut.
It's a very lucrative rut, and it's what he does, and it's who he is. It's his triumph. His triumph really is he wanted to be famous. He is famous. He's a pop star. He always admired Elvis Presley. He really wasn't somebody who admired Wes Montgomery. It's a triumph for him. The only problem is he couldn't get out of it. Yeah. And so it's the good news is the bad news.
And you walked away from him over a rather nefarious thing that he did with songs that your son Leo had written.
Well, yeah, I was out of joint. You know, it was business as usual, frankly. What happened was he wasn't writing songs, and my son happens to be gifted, and at the time he was 15 years old, and he was out on tour with us, and he'd written all these songs, and he was hanging with Steve, and they were playing guitar, and one thing led to another, and my son wrote a lot of tunes. They were very catchy. He was closer in age to the audience than Steve was, so he understood what was going on. And so Steve wound up recording them, and 4 of the songs, I think it was, wound up on Steve's album. And Steve, as he would with anybody, took the publishing without asking, said, this publishing is mine. And that is business as usual. It's not like he did anything that wasn't industry standard. It's just that he did it to a 15-year-old kid, and he didn't...
a 15-year-old kid that he really liked, too. The two of them got along really well.
That he loved. Yeah. He was Uncle Steve. Yeah. And he doesn't need the money, my God. You know, he's got all the money. There was no reason for it. Yeah. And it wasn't so much Steve as it was, at that point, it was the business. I recognized, number one, I couldn't be around rock and roll anymore. It was just brutal, and there was no redeeming aspect if you're interested in anything other than beer and money, and so that was it, and that ended our relationship. It's really kind of sad for both of us, I think, because we lost the connection, but that was it. Yeah.
That brings me to what I wanted to ask you about the time. You were in that business at a time when it really began to change, when it became less about the creative process and the artists, as it was in the 60s, the singer-songwriter thing, and became more corporate, and everything that we saw that happened through the 70s and 80s. And there was one story that you tell in the book that I thought encapsulated it perfectly, and I think I just have to say one word to you, and you'll know what I'm talking about, and that word would be hemostat.
Hemostat, right.
Yeah. So tell that story, because that really says it all, I think.
That's right. So I was on tour. This was probably 1978 or something, and I was signed to Arista Records. And, you know, I was schlepping around the country, going to radio stations, glad-handing DJs, doing my best to say, hi, it's me, I'm here, here's my new LP. And we weren't making a lot of headway. And after one of these long days, the promo man from Arista Records took me aside. We were having dinner, and he said, Ben, I got to tell you something. You know, they're really going to drop your project. I can feel it back in the office. They're talking about other stuff. And just between you and me, I like you, but if you have any juice with Clive Davis, now is the time to use it. Clive being the president of Arista. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you got to get him to spend some money. I said, well, like what? He said, well, you know, if we had an item that we could lay on these DJs that gave them the message that Arista cared about you and it was something really hip and something really cool, that'll make all the difference. I said, like what? He said, well, I got this idea. A hemostat. Now, a hemostat is like a little alligator clip that at the time they would use to smoke joints, to hold the roach.
Like a roach clip. Yeah.
A roach clip.
Yeah.
He said, now, if you could go to Clive Davis and ask to get a bunch of hemostats with, you know, the name of the record on it, the doctor's in, Ben Sidran, I think that'll help. And I said something like, and if I can't do that, he said, well, I'm afraid your project's done. So for the lack of 100 hemostats,
I know.
my project ended.
Well, having worked in private radio in the 70s and into the 80s, though I'm quick to say I worked in the newsroom,
yeah.
I wasn't a jock, but I watched the kind of swag that came in from record companies as they were promoting albums, and it was just breathtaking.
Yes.
And that was when everything began to shift.
Yeah.
Now, you, over the course of your musical career, you have subsequently pretty much gotten to do, well, it seemed to me that you were on the road almost all the time, which is kind of frightening. But you always came back here to Madison.
Always.
Like, this was the anchor for you.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, true to the words of one of your heroes, Mose Allison, you did what you wanted to do. For you, it wasn't about the money. For you, it was, well, as the title of the book is, a life in the music. You were in the music.
Yeah, yeah.
How hard a life was that? Was it always, you always had to hustle to make sure you'd make ends meet for your family and, you know, all that stuff?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But it wasn't that hard, really. I mean, I was playing music. I mean, there were a lot of times where I was 6 weeks out, you know, and I was thinking, I better get lucky here. But we were never poor, and I was always doing exactly what I wanted to do. I mean, for me, the good news was the bad news. No record company ever quite knew what to make of me, but they thought there was a shot there. And so a half a dozen took shots with me, and I was left on my own. It probably would have been better for me if I had worked with somebody who knew more about what was going on than me at the time, but it didn't work out that way. So I was free. I wrote a few hundred songs. I made 30 albums. I traveled around the world. I met all my heroes. It was fantastic. It was really fantastic. And the fact is that the frustration was never about money. The frustration was I had all these ideas, and I would get these ideas. Like at one point I had this idea. I wanted to go around to the cities in the United States and do something, well, I had different names, but at one point it was called Jazz Tour USA. And I would go to New Orleans, and I was going to get the New Orleans musicians, and I was going to show the food and the culture. And the idea was to show that the music is part of a greater cultural life. And at the time, nobody was making things like that. Mm-hmm. And I could have made an hour show for like $20,000.
Well, I mean, I think now, I remember reading about you coming up with that idea and thinking, well, this is Dave Grohl's Sonic Highways.
Oh, exactly.
That's exactly what
when I saw Grohl's show, I said, well, thank you very much. There it is.
Yeah,
30 years later.
30 years later.
And 100 times more expensive.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get it funded. And I tried everything. I formed a nonprofit corporation and wrote grants to the government. I mean, for everything that I did manage to do, there were 10 other things that fell by the wayside. Yeah. And that was the hard part, the frustration of watching these good ideas go.
Well, it was funny, you know, you talk about, first of all, you had that interview program that you did on NPR, National Public Radio, and then you did they had the show on VH1, which I thought was interesting because you described how the show, which was about jazz, they filed away for airtime late in a Sunday night, like they do with stuff like that. Jazz has always been marginalized that way, but but then they decided that they wanted they liked the concept of this so much that they were going to do it with every other form of music.
Yes.
So it was a victim of its own success because when all the other ones didn't work, yours got canned along with theirs.
Nothing will kill jazz faster than success, you know, because people get inspired to try to make money with jazz, and you can't. It's like a jazz club. If a jazz club doesn't serve food and liquor or whatever, if it's a coffee bar, forget it.
Yeah.
Jazz can't pay the rent.
Yeah, yeah. I know a friend of mine said to me recently, you know, jazz aficionados, jazz buffs, when they go to see somebody play in a club, they're notorious. They're bad tippers for one thing, and they're notorious for not drinking a lot. They'll have one drink and nurse it all night long.
Absolutely.
And nobody's making any money off it.
Nobody's
so club
making
owners
any
say
money.
That's enough of that.
Right.
Yeah.
And the same thing happened here with public radio. You know, when it came time, public radio in the States now is almost entirely funded by listeners. And when it came time to beg for money, the jazz listeners didn't step up.
Yeah.
The talk radio listeners stepped up. The But jazz,
Yeah.
it's been one of those things.
We have about 3 or 4 minutes left, and I wanted to ask you finally about you moving into the whole area of liturgical music and Jewish music, because that was an idea that you had. That was a project that you wanted to do.
Yeah.
And you thought, I guess initially you thought it would be easy because most of the guys running the record company were Jews.
Absolutely.
And it turned out that it was, because of that, it was harder.
It was harder.
How come?
Well, I'll tell you a little story. They once asked Irving Berlin, what did being a Jew have to do with his success as a songwriter? He said, absolutely nothing. I'm an American songwriter. They asked George Gershwin the same thing. Mr. Gershwin, what does being a Jew have to do with it? He said, absolutely nothing. I'm writing the great American opera. Bob Dylan said, yes, it's true I have a large nose, but it's because I'm a Cherokee Indian. Saying that being a Jew has nothing to do with it is the most Jewish thing you can say in America. And it goes up the corporate chain to the execs. Yes, they're Jewish. Yes, they accept the B'nai B'rith Award, but no, you know, they don't want to be exposed. And rightly so. You know, it's business, and, you know, the business of business is business. And I should have known that, but I did find it out in the end. And in the end, the project had its own life, and it was okay.
Well, it was interesting. There was a line from one of these guys, I know it was Krasno or one of them, who said to you, Ben, you don't understand. I'm sure it'll sell, but I don't believe it'll sell. And that's what's important. I don't believe it.
Yeah. He said that. Krasno said that. Because I said to him, look, you put out all this horrible gangster rap, and a lot of it is terrible. It doesn't sell. Why wouldn't you put out this beautiful Hebrew liturgical jazz record? And he said, I'll tell you the truth, nobody else will, because I don't believe it can sell. Maybe it'll sell. I'd like another copy myself. But I believe that horrible gangster rap can sell, and that's what this is about.
Yeah, all about him believing it. So, in our last minute, you're firmly now ensconced back here in Madison. Oh, yeah. Your health is good.
Yes.
After a little heart
heart attacked me, right?
You mentioned that your heart attacked you. And you still play with this bar that we're sitting in now. You play here every Tuesday night. Do you, when you look back on it, especially after having written that book, and that was a while ago that you wrote that book, but still, and I know you have to be a note keeper because, man, that book is detailed.
Yeah.
You got to be very happy with how it all worked out for you and how it worked out for your son as well.
Amazing. Really, I feel blessed. I am lucky. I'm really lucky. Judy and I have been married for almost 50 years. We met here on campus when she was 18 years old, and we've been all over. I've played all this music. I was forced, despite my best intentions, to find out what it was that I could do and do that as opposed to try to imitate my heroes. And it worked out, and it turns out that's all you need to do. And I'm kind of emeritus now. I'm a gentleman jazz musician. I go around and play the gigs I want to, and I'm writing books, and I come down here every Tuesday in the summer, and I play for free. I don't get paid, and people don't pay to come in, and it's a good thing.
Well, it has been a pleasure to meet you. I was going to say it's been an honor, but I won't do that because you said that. Who was it you said that to
McCoy
once?
Tyner.
McCoy Tyner. It's an honor to meet you, and he said, man, don't do that to me.
Don't do that to me.
So, Ben, it's been a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.